And you got to think about what happens when a relationship or a marriage breaks down. Quite often a lot of those disputes involve one of the biggest assets that's a business. It might be owned by one party or another, may involve multiple businesses, including businesses owned by both persons to the relationship. And so you often have to ask, is it a family law dispute or is it also a commercial dispute hiding underneath? And it's quite possibly concurrent different disputes that might operate partially in the family jurisdiction and other parts may operate in the state courts. It really depends on the nature of the dispute and the business and what's going on. That's something that can quite often occur.
Well, that can occur in circumstances if both parties, for example, are directors of that commercial entity, whether there's any debt and or any proceedings relating to the running or the um, less obvious components of that entity, superannuation, staff. There's a lot to consider when a family law matter involves these types of commercial assets called. If it's cash in the bank, then it's literally trying to work out how to split that asset pool. If it's more complicated, then of course, then the matter can become in itself more complicated.
Yeah, it's quite right. So, I mean, it's there's a lot of considerations for lawyers to make at the beginning, whether or not it requires any kind of commercial expertise and advice, where the matter should be resolved, how it should be resolved, who the parties and persons involved are, the directors, the shareholders, what the assets are, any valuation issues. There's so many things to consider. Family law asks things like what are the assets, liabilities, and financial resources, like you set out. And commercial law asks things like who owns what, who controls what legal obligations sit behind what structures. When there's a business, you need to look at it from both lenses. The non-business spouse, if there's only one side to the business, may not understand what is really there. You've also spoken to that, and that's quite often a common thing that I think most practitioners see is that there's not awareness from both sides about what assets exist and how they operate, what they generate.
Correct. Yeah, correct. And there might also be, in many cases, a real disparity between what either one of those parties actually thinks the value of the business is, and then what the actual business value is in real terms. And that often is a real tricky issue for either one or, if not both of the parties. For example, the business might be carrying a lot of debt, and one party might not be aware of that debt. However, that the debt component and directors' loans, for example, component forms a huge part of how much that business actually is worth.
I know, for example, I was brought into a matter recently where the family law lawyer, who was also a family law specialist, accredited specialist, didn't understand how to pull apart a trust structure, and there was non-compliance by the husband with assisting with sort of resolving, signing documents to ensure that our client was effectively removed. Our mutual client I was brought in as a contractor to this firm, and we had to assist them in deciphering and going through and analysing the trust documents and explaining to them how it would be done and how it could be done. Um, and that ultimately, in that case, really, that what happened was we weren't involved at the time that the final orders were made by the court, unfortunately, but those final orders were actually not satisfactory to give effect to what needed to occur in terms of removing. And as a consequence, the husband actually played into that, use it to delay and procrastinate. Now, you could argue that the parties would need to obviously act in good faith to bring about implementation of the orders, and that if we were to issue a contravention application, technically there may not have been any contravention, although the husband may have been acting in bad faith by not assisting to implement the orders properly and give effect to them, which meant effectively severing and removing our client, the former wife, from that trust. It just goes to show a situation where sometimes you do need to bring in, for example, a commercial lawyer that has that expertise around trusts. And sometimes the most cost-effective way is to just bring a lawyer in. and get them to
Sure,
give someone a second opinion. Sometimes you just need a second brain to look at it. Wouldn't you
sure.
agree?
Oh, absolutely. And tax lawyers and various other legal specialists that might be able to assist, even forensic accountants that might be able to assist. What I can say is that my experience is that the judges in the family court quite often have a commercial background. That commercial background, when a a matter requires a third party like a judicial officer to make decisions in circumstances where, for example, the parties or the litigants can't agree or work something out for themselves, or their lawyers can't work something out for themselves, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind and in my experience that the family court judges have an absolute acute and very good understanding of commercial law.